So the 10th century is, from the point of view of the papacy, an extremely bad century. Very, very, very embarrassing. I once heard a Dominican friar say, the best thing about the 10th century is that they didn't have television in the 10th century. The reason for this is because the local nobility around Rome had taken over the papacy. Since the Frankish kings in the middle of the 8th century gave temporal dominion over central Italy to the popes, possession of the papacy became obviously the highest prize to be obtained by a local noble family. This was restrained somewhat in the first 100 years or so because the Frankish kings effectively dominated the region and were able to prevent the Bishop of Rome becoming the plaything of the local aristocracy. But from the decline of the Carolingian Empire in the second half of the 9th century, it became more and more the case that the papal election was out of control and completely corrupt, and particularly the Theophylacti family, who were the most powerful local dubious wealthy group, they managed to take control of the papacy, and there was a sequence of embarrassingly unworthy candidates, the most spectacular of which was Pope John XII, who was pope in the middle of the 10th century. He was 18 years old when he was elected. He's accused of all sorts of terrible things. Nobody seems terribly concerned to deny any of these accusations, and adultery, witchcraft, you name it. And in fact, he died, he was murdered by the husband of a woman who he was committing adultery with. So not a good way to go, whatever you are, but especially not if you're the Pope. So yes, very, very bad from that point of view in the history of the Church. Although the papacy was a complete disgrace during this period, that isn't really a doctrinal problem from a Catholic point of view. The First Vatican Council didn't define the impeccability of the Pope. The First Vatican Council defined the infallibility of the Pope. That is, that when the Pope makes a final decision in a matter of faith and morals binding on all the faithful, God will ensure that he doesn't err at that moment. There is no guarantee built into that he will be a good person. So really immoral popes don't really threaten the claims of the Catholic Church about her own divine constitution. The subsequent founding of Cluny Abbey, which we'll be talking about shortly, its ideals, they began to percolate through the church towards the end of the century and led to a general renewal in the church and a desire to make a Christian life more livable for lay people. One of the problems was that the fall of the Carolingian Empire meant that Western European society became much more violent. It had been very violent anyway in the wake of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, but the disappearance of a proper central authority made this even worse. Essentially, the kind of social organization that people were living in the West was a sort of mafia-style organization where you essentially gave a share of your produce to a local hard man in exchange for that local hard man protecting you from other hard men who would like to steal your land and give it to someone else or take a larger share of your produce. And these hard men would enter into mutual agreements to protect each other in case other local robber barons federated and tried to steal your territory or their territory. And this is essentially what we call the feudal system. The problem with this, apart from the fact that it's not really an ideal form of organization in the first place, but the problem is that the people involved, even if they mean well, even if they genuinely want to protect their people against other bad people, nevertheless, this form of life involves endemic violence and therefore constant violation of the commandments. And this becomes a serious problem because you have the entire elite of Western Europe denied the possibility of salvation because they're inherently living an extremely violent and dangerous life. So this problem would be resolved in a more profound way in the following century, but already the clerics of the 10th century were trying to find a way around it through what's called the peace of God and the truce of God. The peace of God was a rule that certain groups of people must be exempt from this kind of violence. Women, children, religious, Jews, they were seen as not fair game in the feuds between the various different parts of 10th century society, and therefore they had to be left alone. The truce of God was that just certain holy times, feast days, Sundays, Advent, Lent, they were exempted from any such violence. They couldn't occur on those times because it would be sacrilegious. This was the beginning of the imposition of a set of rules of interaction between lay princes in order to bring peace and order back to Christian society, a code that would eventually, after further development, become known as chivalry. If you look at Denzinger, the famous manual of infallibly defined teachings in the history of the Church, it's all arranged in order of pope. But when you get to the 10th century, there's just pope after pope after pope after pope with no teaching intervening between the names of the popes because they were completely preoccupied with their sinful and worldly activities and had no time to issue any teaching. One interesting exception to that is the canonization of Ulrich of Augsburg. Ulrich of Augsburg was a bishop of Augsburg, as the name suggests, in Germany. The reason why it's notable is because the process of canonization had now established itself. In the first millennium, largely canonizations were local and spontaneous. They consisted of the local bishop raising to the altars a holy man from that area, miracles having manifested themselves in response to prayers for his intercession by the local people, and sometimes the person will become more widely known because they were of more general significance for the church. Over the last century of the first millennium, the See of Rome began to contemplate the idea of official centralized canonization, and the formulas which were used for this resemble the formulas which are used for infallible definitions. And so it's generally viewed among theologians that papal canonizations are infallible. So this wouldn't apply to the canons of saints of the other non-Roman ritual churches. We could say that they were infallible on account of their antiquity and universality if the saint is venerated outside of their tradition, because that would be the ordinary and universal magisterium recognizing the sanctity of the person in question. And the ordinary and universal magisterium is also infallible. But in regard to the extraordinary magisterium, the power to define doctrines, that is confined to ecumenical councils and popes. And so in general, it's papal canonizations which are considered infallible. There's been some dispute about this question, but the problem with any questioning of this position is at least the theoretical power of the Pope to canonize somebody infallibly. Obviously, one would have to look at the particular formula used in each instance as to whether or not it invoked papal infallibility, but many of them very clearly do invoke the infallible teaching authority of the Pope. And if one therefore said that the Pope didn't infallibly canonize, one would be suggesting that the Pope had failed to teach something infallibly which he intended to teach infallibly because of error on his part concerning the scope of papal infallibility. And were one to concede that principle, that would mean that my private judgment as to the scope of papal infallibility was the final determinant of whether or not I gave assent or withheld assent to a teaching issued by the supreme teaching authority in the Church. And that would undermine all teachings, all definitive teachings, and reduce the public, verifiable character of Catholic teaching to a matter of private judgment. So, for what it's worth, I think it would be perilous to deny the infallibility of canonizations. For other people, during the 10th century, things were going quite well, not least the Byzantine Empire, which is, of course, still Catholic at this point. The term Byzantine is a bit misleading. Nobody used it at the time. The people in Constantinople and the territories ruled by Constantinople referred to themselves as Romans, Romaioi. They did not consider themselves to be Greeks or Byzantines. From 800 onwards, after the coronation of Charlemagne, Latins in the West started to refer to people in the Eastern Empire as Greeks, and sometimes even call the emperor Rex Graecorum, king of the Greeks, or slightly less offensively, Imperator Graecorum. But either of those titles would be extremely offensive to the Romans in the East, because the word Hellene or Greek meant in those times, and had done for many centuries, a pagan. In Greek, to call someone a Greek at that time meant to call them a pagan, and they themselves referred to themselves as Romans. The reason why the Latins had started questioning this and changing their usage is because of the claim now by the Latin Westerners to possess an emperor in their own right. The Macedonian dynasty that was founded by the Emperor Basil I, who murdered his predecessor Michael III and deposed Photius, although he later brought him back, as we discussed last century. This dynasty was extremely stable and survived all the way into the middle of the 11th century, and it presided over a wonderful period of recovery and expansion in the Roman Empire in the East. Many territories were reconquered that had been lost for centuries, such as Antioch. Even some sources claim that at one point Roman armies got as far south as Nazareth itself, so really within quite an achievable distance of Jerusalem, but they never did manage to retake Jerusalem, and some people doubt the reliability of those sources, but nevertheless the expansion was considerable, also back up to the Danube and further north, further into the Balkans. So it was a wonderful period for the Byzantines. During the attempted invasion and conquest of England by the pagan Vikings in the previous century, the one English king who survived, Alfred, King of Wessex, who effectively became the first king of England as a consequence of surviving and of his victories, later victories against the Vikings, he considered the question of why God would allow something like that to happen to a Christian people, as the English then were. And he came to the conclusion, which I think he derived from the writings of St. Bede, that God favours in his providential protection under the New Covenant those nations which further the propagation of the gospel. So it's not like the Old Covenant where there's direct rewards and punishments in the natural order for virtue and vice, but rather God protects and promotes those who facilitate the gathering into one of the scattered children of God. This is an observation that Bede makes in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, and Alfred translated that and a number of other texts, or had them translated in some cases, into Anglo-Saxon in order to promote the knowledge of the faith among his people, and also he promoted missionary activity outside of England. He wrote in his introduction to one of these books, "Remember what temporal punishment came upon us when we neither loved wisdom ourselves nor allowed it to others." And this principle seems to apply to the Byzantine Empire in this period, because the Byzantines had in general not been particularly zealous about missionary activity. They'd largely thought, well, we'll reconquer the barbarians first and then we can convert them to Christianity once they're safely inside the empire. But during the 9th and 10th centuries, they were responsible for a number of very, very important missionary initiatives, two in particular which have saved the souls of millions of people. The first is the one we've already discussed, the mission of Cyril and Methodius to Great Moravia, in the course of which St. Cyril constructed the alphabet for the Slavic languages, which would go on to facilitate the evangelization of many other Slavic countries. But in the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire was approached with a view to conversion by St. Vladimir, Prince of Kiev. And he arranged a marriage treaty whereby he married a Byzantine princess, and he himself was baptized in Kherson, in the Crimea, and he then facilitated the general baptism of the Rus, the Ukrainians. And this, of course, is the origin of the Christianity of Ukraine and the surrounding countries, Belarus and Muscovy, or as it likes to call itself, Russia, and so is therefore responsible for the salvation of many, 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 many souls over many, many, many centuries. And it's interesting that in this period of two great missionary expeditions, temporal success once again came to the Byzantine Empire, apparently vindicating Alfred's insight into the workings of providence. The Empire of Charlemagne had been divided into three in the year 843, an eastern section, Francia Orientalis, which is the origin of modern Germany, a central section, Lotharingia, which is the origin of the modern states of the Rhineland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which have gone backwards and forwards between France and Germany, Switzerland and northern Italy, and then Francia Occidentalis, Western Francia, which is the origin of the modern state of France. Eventually, the Carolingian dynasty, the descendants of Charlemagne, were ejected in all of those territories, the last one being in Francia Occidentalis, what we now call France. And in the period after the siege of Paris, when Odo of Paris, the first non-Carolingian since the middle of the 8th century to rule Francia, was elected king of Western Francia, the crown had alternated between Odo's family and the family of Charlemagne. Finally, one of Odo's great-great-great-nephews, Hugh Capet, was elected king of the Franks in 987, the year before the conversion of Saint Vladimir of Kiev, and his dynasty held on to the French throne all the way down to the French Revolution and shortly thereafter in the 19th century. Revolution in the 18th, last few kings in the 19th. Many countries in Western Europe and Central Europe were converting to Christianity at this time. Mieszko, the Duke of Poland, converted the Poles to Christianity in the 960s. At the end of the century, St. Stephen of Hungary brought about the conversion of the Hungarians. So there's a general extension of the gospel beyond the former political frontiers of the Western Roman Empire and beyond the political frontiers of the Carolingian Empire over this period. In 910, early in the century, a very important event occurred which would begin to lay the seeds of a revival in the church and a reform of the papacy. This was the founding of the Abbey of Cluny. Cluny is in Burgundy, and the abbey was founded by Duke William of Aquitaine. William of Aquitaine did something novel with Cluny. He didn't allow his family to have any rights regarding the appointment of the abbot of Cluny. And he also arranged for the abbot of Cluny to only be subject to the Pope, not to be subject to his local diocesan bishop. These innovations, as they were at the time, effectively created the first religious order. Now, in the first millennium, a religious order meant a group in society that was bound by religious vows to God, classically of poverty, chastity, and obedience, although that hadn't been formalized at this point. Whereas religious order, the term religious order in the second millennium came to mean a group of people who follow a distinctive rule and have some sort of central organization. This isn't at all what the term meant at the time that Cluny was founded. There couldn't be any such organization because Cluny or any other abbey couldn't rule over a religious house in another diocese because the abbot of Cluny was subject to the bishop of his diocese, or he would have been were it not for the arrangements that attended the founding of that abbey. And therefore, if he tried to rule over monks in another diocese, that authority would be a usurpation of the authority of the bishop of that other diocese. So every religious community, even if it had some daughter houses that were subject to it, all of that would have to be contained within a single diocese. by arranging for the freedom of election, which is, of course, envisaged by the rule of St. Benedict, for the abbot, free from lay patronage, and also the immunity of the abbot of Cluny from episcopal jurisdiction and his direct subjection to the Pope, William of Aquitaine allowed for a federation of religious houses across the entire world in principle. Cluny became famous for the observance of its monks and for the beauty of its liturgy. And so many lay people elsewhere who were founding monasteries in the hope that the monks in future would pray for their souls and that of their relatives when they found themselves in purgatory after their deaths, they were attracted by Cluny because obviously the appointment of abbots by lay patrons tends towards corruption and abuse. And what would often happen is a noble family which had to divide its territory between all surviving male heirs of the current head of the family would worry that its influence would decline as the territories became smaller and smaller. And so to avoid that, they would give territory to an abbey, but retain the right of nomination of the abbot. And that would then mean that the eldest son in the family, who inherited the right of nomination, would effectively control that territory and often nominate as abbot some minor member of his family in order to ensure that his family did control that territory. That would mean that the person wasn't really appropriate as an abbot, often wasn't a monk at all, and therefore discipline and piety would decline in the monastery in question. Disconcerted lay people would be keen, therefore, to arrange for a Cluniac monk to come and reform their abbey. When such reforms occurred, Cluny very often would not restore the autonomy of the reformed abbey, but would give it a prior instead of an abbot, and the prior would be appointed by the abbot of Cluny, therefore effectively becoming just an extension of Cluny Abbey. And that was the first form of religious life to establish itself as a sort of federal, international, diocese transcending entity within the church. The other great novel development in the 10th century was the restoration of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire is actually a term that is used slightly later, but it's generally applied to the entity that was created by the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, and that had foundered through the decline of the Carolingian dynasty. At the halfway through the first half of the 10th century, a new dynasty began to assert itself in Germany, the Dukes of Saxony, who at that time was a man called Henry the Fowler, who became the king of Eastern Francia, and it became the most centralized, consolidated and powerful of the provinces, or the former provinces of the Carolingian Empire, the Empire of Charlemagne. And his son, Otto I, Otto the Great as he's known, not only managed to consolidate his power over Germany, but he also managed to go down into Italy and be crowned emperor. There'd actually been several decades with no emperor in the West because of the chaos into which the Carolingian Empire descended. But once Otto was crowned emperor in 962, it became conventional from that point onwards, all the way down to the year 1804, for the person who was elected ruler of Germany by the great princes of Germany to then be seen as the candidate to be crowned emperor by the Pope in Rome. In fact, it was the disgraceful John XII who crowned Otto the Great emperor, but soon after he treacherously betrayed Otto, and then Otto had him deposed. And in fact, this began to curtail the corruption in the papacy for the last half of the 10th century. Some of the popes, the ones who were elected locally by the local robber barons in central Italy, tended to be pretty corrupt. But the ones who were nominated by the emperors back in Germany, which they could get away with doing when they had sufficient troops available to them in central Italy to enforce their will, they tended to be relatively respectable individuals. And the century ended with one such Pope, Sylvester II, sitting on the throne of St. Peter. At the same time as he was Pope, the grandson of Otto the Great was also the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto III, a young man. His mother was a Byzantine princess called Theophanu. The Ottonian dynasty was keen to strengthen its imperial credentials by a diplomatic and matrimonial relationship with the Byzantine emperors in the east. And there even seemed a prospect of a possible long-term cultural reunion between the Eastern and Western traditions through a union of this nature. In fact, not only was Otto III the son of a Byzantine princess, but he was betrothed to an even more exalted Byzantine princess, Zoe Porphyrogenita, who was the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VIII. Constantine VIII never actually ruled. He ruled nominally jointly with his elder brother, Basil II. Basil II was actually the longest reigning emperor in Roman history. He was Roman emperor in Constantinople from 976 until all the way up until 1025, and he won many victories building on the triumphs of the two emperors who preceded him, and extended the frontiers of the empire, particularly at the expense of the Bulgarians. But he never married. His brother Constantine VIII did marry, but he only had two daughters, and one of these daughters, Zoe, was betrothed to Otto III. This would have been very significant because Basil wouldn't allow Zoe or her sister to marry anyone within his own empire, because he didn't want his position to be destabilized by a powerful family who people anticipated would one day inherit the throne. So he had no children himself, and he didn't allow his nieces to marry, with this one exception of Zoe going off and being betrothed to Otto III. So had they actually married and had children, those children would have been the heirs of both the Macedonian dynasty in the east and the Ottonian dynasty in the west. Alas, however, Otto died unexpectedly young in the year 1002, and Zoe discovered this before she could marry him. She just landed in Italy, and so she got back on her boat and sailed back to Byzantium. And the possible tantalizing prospect of a dynastic reunion of the East and the West for the first time since the days of Theodosius was taken away. And unfortunately, instead of a reunion of East and West, the terrible schism which scarred Christian history thereafter was soon to occur in the following century.